Well, we're back for installment 3 of our little video sort of discussion here on Unit 8 Assignment 6. And we were just finishing up talking about political machines and bosses. We said a little bit about New York and Tammany Hall. I need to mention the guy that was responsible for putting that all together was Boss Tweed, who was a sort of nefarious character in New York urban politics. He's almost acquired a sort of legendary reputation. Stole millions off the top of various city projects during the decades he was in power. Finally brought down, and his racket, so to speak, was busted by Samuel Tilden, who ended up running in that bizarre election against Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876 and losing. So that was the end of at least that form of the Tammany Hall machine. But anyway, all the problems we've been talking about and the situations eventually led to calls for reform. And one of the first types of reform institutions that developed were what were known as settlement houses. With these settlement houses, you'd have young, idealistic, well-educated, middle-class men and women, probably fresh right out of college educated, who would acquire some property, a house or whatever, in an immigrant neighborhood. And they'd go in there and they'd move there and they'd live in those neighborhoods, and they would turn their house, their settlement house, into a sort of de facto community center. And they would live right there in the neighborhood with these working class immigrants. They'd learn about their problems firsthand. They'd get to know them. There'd be some trust would be developed and what have you. And they'd provide services for those neighborhoods to try to relieve the effects of poverty there in the neighborhood. They taught English. They had English language classes for immigrants. They really did a lot of pioneering in early childhood education. They set up some of the first daycare centers so that the parents could go off to work during the day and not have to worry about what was going on with the kids. They taught vocational skills, and they also set up sort of cultural centers where the people of the various ethnicities that made up these immigrant neighborhoods could hold sort of cultural festivals and dinners and have traditional dances and things like that, so they could maintain some sort of hold on their native culture while being thrust into this sort of urban American wilderness, for lack of a better term. The most famous of these settlement houses was built in Chicago, and it was opened in 1889 by a woman named Jane Addams. Now that's Addams with two D's, A-D-D-A-M-S. Jane Addams was a very, very influential individual in the late 19th and early 20th century. She actually ended up winning the Nobel Peace Prize, I believe in 1931, for her efforts on behalf of world peace. But at this point, she was known for pioneering the sort of prototypical, model settlement house in Chicago known as Hull House. She comes up on the AP exam quite often, so she's somebody you don't want to forget about and you want to make note of. All right, that's settlement houses. Next topic, the churches, the various churches in the inner cities got involved with reform efforts as well. And there was an urban reform movement that became known as the social gospel. What happened was, in the 1880s and 1890s, groups of Protestant clergymen in cities began to take on and espouse the causes of reform in the inner cities. Their view was that good Christian practice would dictate that one would want to help out one's fellow man, and there was plenty of help that needed to be doled out in late 19th century American cities, so there was plenty of work to be done. The guy that pioneered this was a guy by the name of Walter Rauschenbusch. and I'll leave you to decode the spelling of that from your reading. But he went into one of the worst neighborhoods in New York City. It was known as Hell's Kitchen, and set up his ministry there, and not only preached the gospel and did the typical thing that a minister would do for his congregation, but also helped provide social services. So what they're doing is they're taking the idea of religion and linking it to the cause of social justice. And that was seen to be needed more than any place else in these American cities. And you know, the churches had to adapt to these new urban environments, and you had some urban evangelists. The Salvation Army being one of the examples of that, came over from Britain. Other movements, Dwight Moody set up a number of Moody Bible Institutes, which I believe still exist in cities throughout the country. The Christian Scientists established chapters, or I think that's a good enough word to use, chapters in various cities as well. So you had that kind of going on as well. You also had, at the same time and in this urban environment, the further development of the women's movement. And by the post-Civil War period, that was focused upon women's suffrage. Okay, and you had Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's still around. Her most prominent colleague being Susan B. Anthony, and they established the National American Women's Suffrage Association to push to secure the vote for women. Now that was on a nationwide basis in federal elections. Some of the states had already gone ahead and granted women the right to vote earlier in state elections, the first being the state of Wyoming in 1869, largely because the population was so small out there that the women couldn't vote. There'd be like 2 people voting or something. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, a lot of the western states were the first to allow women to vote. The other thing that by 1900 that had taken place almost in every state was that women now could control their own property after their marriage. Remember, the tradition was for a long, long time that when a woman married, any property that she had automatically became her husband's property. But that changes by the beginning of the 20th century. Another area in which women were very active was with the ongoing temperance movement, which of course is going to culminate in the Prohibition Amendment, the 18th Amendment, in 1919. But at this point, there was an organization known as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, and they advocated total abstinence from alcohol, founded by a woman named Frances Willard from Illinois, and by the turn of the century, they had about 500,000 members. So, you know, the social pathology that came along with large-scale alcohol abuse. As we've said before, people in the past drank much more per capita than we do today. The Anti-Saloon League was another organization that worked to close down bar rooms and saloons in the cities. Out west in Kansas, you had this woman named Carrie Nation who would run into local saloons with a hatchet and go back behind the bar and chop open casks and barrels of beer and whiskey. And of course, nobody would stop her because she had a hatchet. And she became infamous for going around and hacking beer and whiskey barrels. There also was, really, believe it or not, an anti-pornography movement that developed in the late 19th century by it was organized by one Anthony Comstock. And Mr. Comstock created the Society for the Suppression of Vice, and they became sort of a self-appointed watchdog for American morals. And his group and he were successful in getting Congress to pass the Comstock Law in 1873, which prohibited the mailing or the transport of lewd or obscene photographs and materials. So we took action against that as well. Well, that leaves us with sort of the intellectual and cultural movements that developed in the late 19th century in urban environments. One of the things we need to talk about briefly is changes in education. You now had pretty much across the board some sort of compulsory attendance laws in just about every state by the 1890s. And the United States, we think, had about a 90% literacy rate, which was very impressive for the late 19th and early 20th century. And the up-and-coming thing in the early 20th century is going to be tax-supported public high schools. That's really not going to catch on until the 1920s. Up to that point, basically, you had public education probably up to about 6th or 7th or 8th grade, and then you went out and you got a job. And if you wanted to go on beyond that, you had to pay. It was private. But the public high schools are in the wings. They're coming. You had a lot of colleges set up in the late 19th century. We talked about the Morrill Land Grant Act, which provided the land and the funding for states to set up the state college and university systems. That all starts to kick into gear after the Civil War. You had wealthy philanthropists like John D. Rockefeller endowed the University of Chicago. Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Mellon University, things like that. The other thing that was happening is college curricula were changing, getting away from the dominance of the classics in higher education and moving toward a more science-based and more modernized curriculum. In many ways trying to copy the German model. The Germans had far and away the best university system of the 19th century. And so if you were an American, for example, and you had aspirations to graduate study and you really wanted to get a good, thorough grounding and rigorous graduate work, you went to Germany. And, of course, what happened was Americans would go over there, they'd study in one of the German universities, and then they'd bring some of the ideas back home to the United States and eventually try to implement them here. One of the first universities set up along the German model here in the United States was local, Johns Hopkins, 1876. Really one of the first effective graduate institutions here in the United States, which focused on individual original research on the part of the students. So you have that going on too. So by the late 19th century, you finally have the first generation of American scholars who can really compete on a level playing field with their European colleagues. So that's something new and different as well.